Lumineers, you just finished watching the first match in the top four, and Jordan took it home with the Amethyst Emerald deck.
Amethyst Emerald. Did you expect to see that in the semifinals of the Lorcana Challenge?
Absolutely not. Leading up to this challenge, everybody was saying how poorly positioned Amethyst Emerald was, and so the fact that it made it into day two, I was already really excited to see. But the fact that they're now in the finals is wild.
It's wild. It is absolutely wild. It's a really fun deck, though. It's a fun combination, and we saw how fast it can be with Jordan's games there.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking before this about how popular it was in Into the Inklands and for set championships, and then when Ursula's Return came out, the Sapphire Ruby decks that originally were a great matchup for that deck got the Sisu lines that could banish a lot of the characters that were being played in Emerald Amethyst, and then of course some of the other decks that were really strong like Emerald Steel had the removal for all of your Amethyst and Emerald cards as well, so people thought it wasn't going to be good, but Jordan found a way to make it work.
Here we are, yes, going into the finals. On the other side, though, we have a match coming up that are two decks that I think people expected to see here.
Yeah, absolutely. We have Kurt and Brian playing a Ruby Amethyst and Emerald Steel deck in the finals, and I mean, we're very familiar with this matchup.
Yes, we are. We've seen it before, and now here, what do you think these players are thinking?
So Kurt has done this before. I mean, we just watched him take down a Emerald Steel deck previously that we were able to cast, and one thing that I was noticing looking through his deck list, he plays a lot of cards that say draw a card, which is really good, especially into this matchup of Emerald where there's a lot of discard that's going on. So I think Kurt's pretty familiar with this, and I think Brian is also going to be thinking of the same things of, okay, I need to discard Kurt's hand. This is the game plan for my deck. Discard all the things, find the Buckies, play the Floodborn characters, and win before Ruby Amethyst is able to get to that 7 ink a little bit further and bounce back.
Yeah. Well, both these players have already earned that golden Mickey, so congratulations to you for that. But let's jump in and see who can make it to the finals with game one of this match.
On to top four.
I'm really excited to see how this plays out. We haven't seen Brian play yet, you and I, but we've watched Kurt, and this deck, I mean, it's really, really strong.
Yeah, typically against, we mentioned earlier in the stream that Green Steel or Emerald Steel usually has a pretty decent matchup into Ruby Amethyst because of its ability to discard their hand, and even though they play Amethyst, a lot of the Ruby Amethyst lists aren't playing as many draw cards as Kurt is, but even starting here in the beginning, we see Eternabog's Followers being played, which is a one-cost character that when it quests, you have the opportunity to banish the card and then draw a card, just replacing itself in your hand while gaining a little bit of lore.
Yeah, so really the name of the game here for Kurt is draw cards, draw cards, draw cards.
Right, and the main reason for that is we see a Bucky that Brian has in his opening hand, so we can expect that to be played on turn 2. As soon as the Bucky comes down, we see the Robin Hood on 1. There could potentially be a Shift Robin Hood come out that is a Floodborn character, so that would require Kurt to discard cards, and the reason it's so important for Kurt to keep his hands really full is so that he has more options of cards to discard, and he doesn't get down to a spot where he doesn't have any cards in hand. So we see Kurt quest with the Eternabog Followers, banishing it to draw a card, then playing a Magic Broom, and then just immediately playing another Eternabog's Followers, banishing the Magic Broom to draw a card as well.
Yeah, and it does look like Brian has that Bucky there, so I'm sure that's going to be the next play that we see here on his side of the board.
I would be surprised if we see anything else. I think I also do spot a Robin Hood shift hidden back there somewhere, so we'll see if Brian decides to shift that on turn 3. Decides to ink a World's Greatest Criminal Mind, a pretty strong card. It's a new song card from Ursula's Return. It lets you choose a character. It goes back to that player's hand. They shuffle their hand and then discard a random card, but if Kurt can keep a full hand, then nothing really, it makes it a lot harder for you to actually discard that card. So we see Kurt go into his turn 3, immediately questing and then banishing the Eternabog's Followers. Just the sequencing on this is really important. Drawing the cards, seeing if there's anything that changes after you draw those cards before you actually play anything else. And we see Kurt just play Friends on the Other Side with the ink. Friends on the Other Side is a song card, but Kurt really values having these cards in hand, so just plays it for 3 to give himself a lot of options.
Yeah, and I think that this is really the same turn 1, 2, 3 just about that we saw just in the quarterfinals. You know, he's really wanting to have the right cards in his hand to answer the cards that Brian's going to be putting down on the board.
Yeah, every game that we've seen from Kurt in the past couple of rounds, he's straight up paid for the friends on the other side on 3 just because he values the card draw so much. And like you said, even in the Emerald Steel mirrors, we oftentimes see the Bucky come down on turn 2 and then the Diablo come down on 3. Diablo is a really strong Floodborn card that says when Diablo is exerted on your opposing character, on your opposing player's turn, when they draw a card, you get to draw a card. So it puts Kurt in an interesting position here where Bucky is going to force Kurt to discard cards every time Brian plays Floodborn characters, but when Diablo is exerted, and we know Kurt values this card draw, Diablo is going to be able to draw cards every time Kurt decides to draw a card as well.
Yeah, and it looks like right now Kurt doesn't really have any answers. I don't see a Brawl in his hand. He did just get a Madame Medusa, but I don't know that he has anything right now with just 3 ink to answer that Bucky or the Diablo.
Yeah, and that's another reason why digging through your deck, getting as far in as you can, drawing a bunch of cards to find those answers, right? The Madame Medusa definitely does the job, but Madame Medusa is not for another 2 turns for Kurt. Kurt only has 4 ink, and it's important for Kurt to continue to ink those cards so that he can get up to the 6 ink and 7 ink to play some of those larger characters that are answers to Brian's board. But without those answers, Brian's going to be able to get away a couple turns with exerting this Diablo. The Diablo is evasive, so the Merlin Rabbit won't be able to challenge into it. Kurt doesn't have very many cards that can interact with evasive characters outside of cards like Madame Medusa and Brawl anyway. So I think it'll be important for Kurt to find some of those pieces in order to keep Brian at bay.
Yeah, and Brian does have a bunch of Floodborn cards in his hands. He has the Flynn, he has that Jafar Dreadnought, which is the card that we see coming down now, and I think he has that Shift Robin Hood as well.
Yeah, and these Floodborn characters are setting up a really interesting puzzle here. We talked about how the Bucky is going to make Kurt discard cards, but Kurt, when he draws cards, is going to also give Brian cards with the Diablo, and now with a card like Jafar Dreadnought, Jafar Dreadnought has an ability that says if he banishes a character in a challenge, Brian gets to draw a card. So if Kurt exerts this Merlin Rabbit to either quest or to challenge anything, then the Merlin Rabbit is going to be susceptible to being banished by the Jafar. You don't want to give Brian even more opportunity to clear your board and draw extra cards. So Kurt may not be able to exert these characters, or if he does, he knows he's doing it at a cost.
Yeah, that Merlin, because he's only at 2 strength, that Jafar Dreadnought would survive and could do it again.
Yes, but we do see a couple bounce cards in Kurt's hand. We see Madame M Snake. I also spot a Madame M Fox. Both
2
of those,
them.
yeah, 2 of them, which is great to bounce the Merlin Rabbit back to hand. It just means picking it up from the board state, putting it back into your hand, and every time Merlin Rabbit enters and leaves play, Kurt gets to draw a card. So he'll get to draw a card here as we see the Madame M Fox go down. Unfortunately, Madame M Fox can't challenge into the Diablo. Normally, Madame M Fox is a really great character because it has rush and it has a lot of strength for a 3-cost character, a 4/3. So it usually trades pretty well into things. But because it does not have evasive, it cannot challenge Diablo that does have evasive.
Yeah, and Kurt is thinking here what he wants to ink. He hasn't inked for this turn. He's eyeing that snake and the fox. He was deciding between the 2. What do you think the difference there is? Madame M Fox has the rush, but Madame M Snake is a less cost.
Yeah, so if you'll notice, out of the cards that he had to ink, we're seeing him thinking about playing the Cusco. He also had the Madame M Snake. I also see a Maui and a fox in hand. The Maui and the fox are 2 rush characters, so he's holding on to those, waiting for Brian to exert some of his cards so he can immediately play them and challenge them to Brian's surprise. You also don't want to ink the Cusco because the Cusco is a card that's going to draw you more cards. We talked about how important this is in this matchup specifically with Brian having the Bucky on board. And so Kurt said, okay, this snake, it doesn't have rush. It's going to be a little bit slow when it comes into play. I'm not going to be able to challenge with it. It's also not drawing me cards. So out of all of the inkable cards in my hands, this is probably the one that has to go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Over here on Brian's side, he has 4 characters out, and then I think we're going to see something else come down here, and that's just such a strong board state compared to what Kurt has out. I'm sure that it's kind of has Kurt feeling on the edge.
Yeah, this is getting worse and worse for Kurt, if I'm honest with you. He really needs to find something like a Be Prepared to just massively wipe this board. Brian is playing strong character after strong character, all of them being Floodborn, setting up, like I said, this weird puzzle where Robin Hood is a really strong character that also is focused on challenging, similar to Jafar Dreadnought. Robin Hood has an ability that says when he challenges and banishes a character, you can gain 2 lore. And so normally in Disney Lorcana, you're either questing or you're challenging or you're singing with your characters. And questing, of course, is how you win the game. It's how you gain lore. So if you're challenging with a character, you're not questing. the fact that Robin Hood can challenge and gain the amount of lore that's also printed on him is basically like he's doing both. So that makes it really strong as a card. He also has a second ability that says if he's banished in a challenge, then you get to draw a card. We do finally see the Madame Medusa come down, though, for Kurt as he gets up to 6 ink. Madame Medusa is a really strong card, being able to banish a character with 3 strength or less.
Yeah. Now, something interesting that happened on Brian's last turn is we saw that Robin Hood Floodborn character come down, but he didn't actually shift it on top of the small Robin Hood. What is the thinking there behind that decision, do you think?
So there might be a few things that Brian is thinking about. One of them is that I was going to say you may not want to go super wide, knowing that Kurt is getting up to 7 ink, but he just played out 2 extra characters, so that may not be a concern for him. The other thing is that if you only have the ink to play the Robin Hood, say for 5, or let's say you shift the Robin Hood for 3 and you have 2 more ink, there's nothing else, and there's nothing in your house else in your hand to play, and you also don't really care if you quest or challenge with the character that turn. It's actually just better for you to play the characters separately, because now you still have the 1-drop Robin Hood that could eventually be used to quest or challenge, or we've seen a couple be King Undisputeds. It would be a good card for Brian to choose to banish if Kurt decides to play something like that, and that way you don't basically get rid of one of your characters when you shift it on top of the other.
Yeah. So we now have 2 Buckies on board. The squirrels are multiplying. And then also that Flynn, again, his own biggest fan, has come down, which, you know, it goes right along with those Buckies, especially with having 2 of them on board. Flynn quests for 4, but it's -1 lore for every card in your opponent's hand.
Right. This is a really scary board state for Kurt because of the 2 Buckies. That means every time that Brian plays a card like Flynn Rider, Kurt is going to have to discard 2 cards from his hand. It's going to be really difficult for Kurt to keep up with that. It's going to be difficult for him to draw that many cards and still play an ink every turn. And so Kurt running out of cards means that Flynn is just going to get stronger and stronger and eventually get to a point where Flynn has 4 lore when Kurt doesn't have any cards in his hand. Flynn is also evasive, so it's going to be really difficult for Kurt to interact with that. Every turn, Brian's going to be able to quest for a bunch of lore with Flynn. We already see Brian up at 9 lore, and he has a ton of lore on board currently.
Yes, yeah. Brian is already at 9 lore, and Kurt is sitting at 3, and really, this board is favoring Brian so much right now.
Yeah, and after playing the Flynn Rider, Kurt's in an interesting position because he needs to continue to play cards to respond to this board. We see him holding the Madame Medusa. You know, you need to play cards like that so that you can get rid of this board and start working on it. He's going to challenge the Bucky and rush with the Fox, but the more cards that Kurt plays, the more that you're fueling that Flynn Rider. So we see Kurt do his best to challenge, to get rid of some of the characters on board, bringing it down a little bit so that hopefully he can draw into some cards that'll help him out.
Yeah, so it looks like he has 2 rabbits there. Yeah, he has 2 rabbits and a Bee King Undisputed. How do you think he's feeling with those cards in his hand versus what Brian has on the board?
So Kurt's doing a pretty good job at coming back from this. The problem is every card that's in Kurt's hand is a good card right now.
Yeah.
We see Brian play a Floodborn character that's going to force him to discard a card. He discards the Bee King Undisputed. Then we see the Robin Hood challenge the Madame Medusa, banishing it and giving Brian 2 extra lore. Kurt's keeping the Merlin Rabbits because he's valuing card draw that much. He knows that he's going to have to find cards to get back into this game. There's specific cards he really needs to look for. I'm thinking primarily of something like a Be Prepared. And so he doesn't draw it on this turn, but he can play a Merlin Rabbit this turn. If he inks this Maui, he can play another Merlin Rabbit to just draw deeper and deeper into the deck, trying to find the thing that he needs to get back into this game.
Yeah, and Brian now is already up to 14 lore now, and it's looking like the game's really going in his favor. I know that we've talked before about, you know, sometimes games can swing really quickly when there's a lore lead like this, but with Ruby Amethyst, it doesn't quite have the same tools to do something like that.
No, Ruby Amethyst is an interesting deck because its game plan can shift a little bit. Sometimes against certain decks, you want to go really fast out the gate, gain as much lore as you can, and then finish out those games with Merlin Goats. But in other games like this, where you have a deck that can actually be more aggressive than you can, you're put in a control position where you need to respond to your opponent. And Ruby Amethyst just doesn't have a ton of cards that are really big, like this Flynn Rider that can quest for up to 4 lore in a turn. It's more of a slow burn where you just continue to build board presence. You remove your opponent's characters so you can slowly quest for lore along the game. And unfortunately, Kurt's had a difficult time keeping characters on board and keeping cards in hand.
Yeah, and if he can't find the answers, I feel like we're just maybe maybe 2 turns away, maybe 3, depending on how the next turn goes. I think now Brian will get up to 19 because let's see here, Flynn will quest for just 1.
Right, because Kurt has 3 cards in hand, and then the Bucky and the Robin Hood could quest for 3, so that'd be a total of 4, and then he also has the Ursula for a 5, going up to 19, I think, if he quested with everything this turn, but Brian may not quest with everything because there's no way for Emerald Steel to gain lore instantaneously, so you don't want to quest out with your really important cards like Bucky before it just wins you the game.
And it looks like maybe he is.
Okay, I think he's gonna. I think he's gonna press it because ultimately, Kurt, it's either be prepared or bust at this point. I think.
True.
Because Emerald Steel doesn't have a way to gain lore instantaneously. Kurt really needs to get rid of all of these characters right now, and if he doesn't, then Brian, it doesn't matter. Kurt's not going to be able to get rid of all of these characters on the board this turn because Flynn Rider's evasive. He only has 1 character. He has the Maui Rush, but there's not going to be a lot. And we see a Queen's Castle being drawn. That's not going to do it for Kurt, I don't think.
Not going to do it. No, maybe if he had seen that earlier. But yeah, it just seems like Kurt wasn't finding the right answers in this game.
I do like this play from Kurt, though. They don't scoop just yet. He challenges the Merlin Rabbit into the Robin Hood to banish the Merlin Rabbit so that he can draw into another card, plays 2 more Queen's Castles, and decides to pass the turn to Brian. And of course, Brian has plenty of lore on turn to take game 1.
Yes, nicely played by both players. And yeah, that Emerald Steel is just a tough matchup. All that discard.
It's a really tough matchup. In previous rounds, we've seen where Kurt has the answers to Emerald Steel. He got the brawls really early, and unfortunately, he had a plenty of card draw early in the game. He just couldn't find those early cards to get rid of your early threats like Bucky and Diablo.
Yeah, and then once, Brian had 2 Buckies on board at one time, and so every time he played a Floodborn, 2 cards were getting lost out of Kurt's hand, and that was just really rough.
Yes, Brian had a perfect curve, honestly, playing a card from turns 1 all the way up to turn 5 with the Robin Hood and discarding cards the whole time, drawing extra cards with Diablo. A super, super strong start. But that's only game 1. This is best of 3. So we can move on into game 2 and see if Kurt can come back, push us to a game 3, or if Brian takes this and moves on to the finals.
Yes, we'll see. So, of course, Kurt, not having won this game, he's going to be on the play, and he'll go first this next game.
Yes, I would expect Kurt to go first. It's important to have that first player advantage to get a couple of those cards down, draw a couple extra cards, and try to get ahead of what Emerald Steel is doing.
Yeah, and with altering your hand in a situation like this, how important is it then for him to be looking for those specific answers, things like Brawl and whatnot for the Emerald Steel matchup?
I think it's really important because you're seeing a lot of cards that Brian's playing. Kurt may have been able to look at the deck list before the match. And so we see these players altering their cards currently. I think you said it very well, Rebecca. Kurt knows very specific cards that Brian needs, or that he needs in order to respond to Brian. And Brawl is one of them to get rid of those Diablos really early. Being able to have a bunch of cards like Chernobog's Followers you see in the opening hand to play, and then draw more cards so that you can find those answers, and so that you can keep cards in hand, so you can continue to ink, get up to 6 or 7 lore, so that if you do end up with a hand where there's nothing in your hand, at least if you top deck and be prepared, you can still play it right. And then of course from Brian's side, it's pretty straightforward. You want to find one of your 1-drops. If you can, find its shift target as well, and then most important than anything, try to find a Bucky that you can play on turn 2. But one other thing to consider is inkability. When you don't want to mulligan a hand or alter a hand that has a bunch of inkable cards in it, because you're more likely to draw uninkable cards after that. And you can get kind of stuck if you have a handful of uninkable cards. You're not able to ink every turn, and you can fall behind. So there's a real balance act between keeping cards that you know are going to be really good into the matchup, but also not putting away too many cards so that you don't end up drawing into a hand of all uninkables.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting here is that we actually just saw Kurt alter his hand. He drew 6 new cards.
Yeah, so Kurt did not see the cards that he wanted to see in that first hand. But that's one of the things I really like about Disney Lorcana. The altar is very generous. You can essentially dig up to 14 cards deep if you want to by drawing your first 7, putting them all back, and drawing 7 more. And it allows for players like Kurt and Brian to find those specific cards that they're looking for. Yeah. It's part of the skill that comes into Disney Lorcana, and honestly one that I don't think is talked about enough, to be honest with you, because the difference between games can be whether or not you find that one card that you need to respond.
Yeah, I think when I first started playing Disney Lorcana, I quickly realized how important altering your opening hand is, and how important that is to the overall strategy.
Right, and if we look at Kurt's hand, we see he has the Turn Box followers, is able to find a Merlin Rabbit as well to just find more cards that draw him more cards. So, that's just showing of how strong it can be to put back cards and find other stuff. He does have a Be Prepared in hand, which is going to be there for a long time, and honestly, not a great draw against Emerald. If Brian decides to play an Ursula Deceiver, then I'm sure that Be Prepared will get discarded, but we will see what Brian decides to do. Oh, okay.
He'll at least get to take a look and see.
Yeah.
Nothing will get discarded with Diablo, unlike Ursula. So Brian will get a good look, though, here at Kurt's hand and what he has coming his way.
Right. Diablo is a pretty strong card because it's a shift target for the Floodborn Diablo, but it also just has that ability that when played, you get to see your opponent's hand, and there's a lot of value that comes with that, knowing what your opponent's next couple turns might look like, also knowing that Kurt has a Be Prepared in hand. So if Brian does eventually find an Ursula, knows that he can play the Ursula and then get rid of the Be Prepared.
Yeah, I feel kind of bad now for Kurt, though, because that Be Prepared and the Madame Medusa, those are both uninkable, such high-cost cards. Madame Medusa being 6 cost, Be Prepared is 7, and they're just going to sit there in his hand, really limiting his options. Even though he has a full hand, it's limiting his options.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate for Kurt because Kurt's only playing 2 Madame Medusas also, so that's one of them. And I imagine if we do see a Bucky come down eventually, or any form of discard from Brian, some of the first cards out of Brian's hand is going to have to be that Be Prepared and that Madame Medusa because of the reasons you just said. They're uninkable, they're expensive. Kurt's not going to get up to that ink total for quite a few turns, and they're not doing any good sitting in his hand, so he's not going to be able to use them and would have to discard them instead. And of course, on cue, the Bucky shows up.
And the Shift Diablo.
Yes, and the Shift Diablo on that turn. That's part of what makes Diablo so strong, honestly, and Shift in general. But in Ursula's Return, the way we shift cards changed a little bit. Before, Shift was exclusively something where you paid a little bit less than you normally would for the card. But in this case, you can see with the Diablo card, you can shift Diablo just by discarding an action card. So you see Brian discard the Baboom to get the Diablo out there, being able to play a Floodborn card the same turn as he played the Bucky and force Kurt to discard.
Yeah, I love this new shift mechanic. I think it really changes the tempo of the whole game. Being able to shift a character and still play another character or action or item, maybe, it really is very helpful for players to be able to have that option there of shifting a card, or of discarding a card to shift a character out.
Yeah, it makes for some really interesting plays because of what you just said. You can get those higher cost characters out really soon, and Diablo is only a 3 cost character, but there's other shift characters that came out in Ursula's Return with shift abilities like this, where they are expensive cards and can sing expensive cards really quickly. We saw how strong something like the Queen was previously that is just a shift 2. So there's some really fun ideas that can open up with something like that.
Yeah, and we did see, because that shift Floodborn Aladdin came down, that Kurt was forced to discard a card, and we did see that Madame Medusa
go
out of
in.
his hand.
I was actually pretty surprised. I was going to bring that up. When the Diablo got shifted, I think Kurt, instead of a Madame Medusa or the Be Prepared, decided to discard a Madame Snake, which surprised me. But of course, Kurt's running low on cards, and you can expect another Floodborn character to come out every turn from Brian's deck. And so, of course, not long after that, he just had to discard the Medusa.
Yeah. And of course, this being a best of 3, and Brian taking game 1, Kurt has to win this game and take it to game 3 if he wants a chance at making it to the finals.
Right. Kurt really needs some answers, and I think that might be why he's keeping the Be Prepared. He knows that it may be his only out in this game. It's a couple turns away, at least 3 turns away for Kurt, but he says, you know what, if I can't find the answers to get rid of this board that Brian's building up, it's a very similar scenario we saw in the last game where Brian just had the turn 1, had the turn 2, and the Shift Diablo on top of that, so even better. Has a turn 3 and a Floodborn turn 4. It just keeps coming at Kurt and won't let up.
Yeah, and we see a Strength of the Raging Fire doing 4 damage to the rabbit there. Of course, Strength of the Raging Fire deals 1 damage for each character that you have on the board. And now Kurt is left with nothing now on the board.
Yeah, nothing on the board. And also Kurt drew a Friends on the Other Side previously too. It would have been great if he could have used that Merlin Rabbit to sing Friends on the Other Side and draw some extra cards. But Brian is playing around that by banishing the Merlin. You don't want to give your opponent the opportunity to bounce those Merlins, rabbits back and forth with to draw a bunch of extra cards. And we see how much Kurt values this card draw, because even though he can't sing Prince on the other side, he instead decides to use 3 cards to pay for 3 friends on the other side and play it just to get extra cards in his hand.
Yeah, if that rabbit had stayed out and he could have sang it, that would have been really great. Merlin is a great singer, actually. Did you know that?
I did not know that. I do love Merlin, though. I have not watched The Sword and the Stone, but I've seen the Merlin character in other areas,
Yes.
and he's a very, very fun character.
He's super fun. He makes a really great appearance in the Magic Happens parade at Disneyland.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. I've never been to Disneyland, but I've been planning to go at some
You
point.
gotta go.
We do see Brian just curve right out into a Beast Tragic Hero there with 5 ink, which is, I mean, man, Brian has really set up a board here, being
Yeah.
able to discard cards with Bucky, draw extra cards with the Exerted Diablo. The Aladdin is there. I don't think there's any items in Ruby Amethyst, but can sing songs like Strength of a Raging Fire, and it's just a big body to deal with. The Jafar Dreadnought is going to keep Kurt from wanting to exert cards, and then the Beast Tragic Hero is going to also give Brian the opportunity to draw extra cards, because Beast has an ability that says if he's not damaged at the start of your turn, you get to draw an extra card.
Yeah, Queen's Castle, I think, might make an appearance here. No, we're getting a brawl on the Diablo. What do you think about that decision?
I think it's a great decision, because you, of course, don't want to fuel Brian's hand. And we see how important card draw is for
Yeah.
Kurt and Amethyst. Of course, every time Kurt draws a card and Diablo's exerted, Brian gets to draw a card. So you don't want to be giving Brian extra cards. He already has a hand full of them. So being able to play the brawl, get rid of the Diablo, and say, okay, at least now I'm free to draw extra cards if I need to, and I'm not going to help Brian in the process.
Yeah. Now, Brian is only sitting at 6 lore, which is not that far ahead. I think that Kurt, especially with that Be Prepared sitting in his hand, maybe has a chance to kind of stop Brian in his tracks coming up on his next turn.
Yeah, it would be a really big play if Kurt is able to play this Be Prepared. It's why he's held it for so long to see if he can get there. And I'll be honest, I'm kind of surprised he's kept it for so long. And an Emerald matchup, as we mentioned earlier, something as simple as an Ursula Deceiver can immediately disrupt this plan.
If that was the Ursula
I was gonna
Deceiver.
say, I wasn't sure if it was the Deceiver or not, but I don't think it is. It's just
a
a Diablo.
but now he can see that that's coming.
The Be Prepared is there.
Yeah.
It's looming.
It is looming. I was wondering if last turn, if Kurt would have played the Queen's Castle out so that that location would stay on board, and then he follow it up with Be Prepared. But do you think he might just go straight into Be Prepared?
I think he has to at this point, to be honest. It's like you mentioned, Brian isn't too far ahead, only having quested for 6, but it looks like there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lore on the board currently, so Brian could jump all the way up to 12. And if you waste any extra time, especially if Brian knows that a Be Prepared is coming, then he may just exert all those characters and say, okay, you can do it, but I at least got a bunch of lore out of it beforehand.
Absolutely. Yeah, that Be Prepared is just kind of waiting in the wings, and Brian knows it's coming, so he has to make a decision here based on what he knows.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, the Queen's Castle isn't a terrible thing to play after. It may not be great in this position, because Kurt really needs to keep cards that he can use to respond. He needs to start gaining some traction in this matchup. Brian has come ahead so far, but it wouldn't be a bad play, because Brian would not have any cards that could respond to the Queen's Castle. The Queen's Castle could slowly start catching up to Brian, gaining that 2 lore every turn, and then if Kurt's able to get some extra characters into the Queen's Castle, draw some extra cards.
Yeah, I do see a sudden chill in Brian's hands there, so... And he is deciding to quest a bunch here.
Yeah, he's going to quest for 4 lore in total, and Brian still has a bunch of ink that he can play. Like you said, there's a sudden chill, but Kurt has 3 cards in hand, so he's going to have to do a lot of discarding before he's forced to discard this Be Prepared. And I imagine Kurt is holding on to Be Prepared until he's forced to get rid of it.
Sure. Yeah, there's no reason for him to choose that to discard. I'm so interested to see what Brian chooses to do here. He is exerting 4. Brings out Flynn. Now, that's an interesting choice. He knows that Be Prepared is coming, and yet he's still playing that Flynn.
That is an interesting choice. I'm trying to see if there's a line where Brian can force Kurt to discard all of his cards.
His entire hand? Can he do it?
Because he's discarded 2, so now Be Prepared is the only one in the hand.
Oh,
and
he
he just
doesn't
passes his
have
turn.
pass his
So
turn.
he's forcing Kurt to draw an inkable card, and he does. He
Oh,
finds the
wow.
friends on the other side, is able to ink it and play Be Prepared. Oh my goodness.
Wow.
That might be
Wow.
game deciding,
Wow.
to be honest with you.
Yes.
Brian playing out all of those characters. I mean, Brian still has a couple cards in hand. He can play a Beast Tragic Hero in response, and it's going to allow Brian to continue to draw some extra cards because Kurt very likely is not going to be able to get rid of this card. But to get rid of such a big board.
Yeah, you had, what, maybe 6 characters out there?
Yeah, I
or
think so.
something?
6 characters representing a ton of lore himself.
A lot of lore.
And Kurt still has a lot to come back from. Brian was able to discard almost every card out of Kurt's hand. Kurt had to ink the friends on the other side. He couldn't risk playing it at all because he has to have the 7 to play Be Prepared. So inks friends on the other side, plays Be Prepared. Now he doesn't have anything in his hand. He's top decking for the rest of the turn. We see him top deck this Merlin Crab. The Merlin Crab's not going to do much, to be honest with you.
No, not when you don't have another character out, because Merlin Crab gives another one of your, or gives any character plus 3 strength. And so if you don't have another character on board, you know, it's another character, but that's about it.
I'll be eager to see if Brian decides to quest or exert the beast at all, because the crab could damage the beast, but it's not going to banish the beast. It would be punished, though, if Kurt manages to draw a rush character like Maui or a rush character like Madame M. Fox, because if you bounce the Merlin Crab back, then you can give the Madame M. Fox that you just played that challenger +3, and it would banish the beast.
Yeah. You know, I do wonder if, you know, because Kurt only had 6 ink, and of course Brian knew he needed 7 ink to play that Be Prepared, and so that's why he had him discard those other 2 cards that he didn't, and then was banking on Kurt drawing an uninkable card, and it was a gamble.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It was a gamble. He said you have to have it, because if not, I think Brian wins the next turn, essentially.
I think you're right.
You can't play the Be Prepared that turn, you draw an uninkable card, Brian just gets so far ahead that he probably takes the game, and that might come back to bite him,
look at that.
There we go.
The Maui.
The Maui comes down, gets rid of the tragic beast that Brian decided to exert. At this point, Brian is just pushing his lore lead. He's already up at 12. He says, I'm just going to have to be aggressive. Every character that I play, I need to quest with and try to get to 20 before Kurt can reestablish and come back from the behind position he had.
Yeah, and he plays another 2 characters down. We see the Ursula, Deceiver of All, and then that Diablo, of course, can't look at your opponent's hand when they don't have anything in hand. And gosh, a Cusco was probably not what Kurt wanted to see.
Yeah, really bad draw for Kurt here. Cusco's not very good at challenging. It's not going to banish anything, and he can challenge something just to banish the Cusco and draw an extra card, but it's a very, very slow turn for Kurt, and Brian is just going to continue to develop a board, build up another big board that Kurt had to work really hard to get rid of in the first place.
Yeah, and I think Brian wins next turn. He has 4 lore now on board, and now he has 5 with that second Ursula coming down.
Yeah.
Kurt, I think, you know, even if he has another Be Prepared that he draws, and I don't think that was it.
I don't think he has to be prepared. He can still challenge with the Cusco into the Ursula, banishing his own Cusco to draw an extra card to see if he can find anything. It's exactly what we see happen. He has a Friends. I don't think that's going to be enough.
Yeah.
He only has 7 ink right now, so if he plays the Friends, he can't play Be Prepared if he draws it. He's going to see what he can draw into anyway. Magic Broom, another friends on the other side. So many friends and none of them are helping.
Yes, he has so many friends and none of them.
And there's the Be Prepared. A little bit too late, though.
Little too late. Yeah, those friends were not helping him out.
No, Kurt's just going to keep drawing cards, see what was at the top of his deck. And Brian takes game 2, going to the finals.
Going to the finals. Congratulations, Brian. Both games very well played. That Emerald Steel deck was doing exactly what it was made to do. He had something to put down every single turn, the right answer at the right time. It was pretty incredible to watch.
It was really gnarly seeing them play a 1 cost, 2 cost, 3 cost, 4 cost, 5 cost, all the way out. And
in both games.
In both games, having the perfect curve, even being able to shift the Diablo as soon as you play the Bucky, force Kurt to discard cards. And goodness, I mean, Kurt played very well. Kurt did everything he could, played to his outs, and unfortunately, Bucky and the Emerald Steel just was too much.
Yeah, he had that Be Prepared, and he was able to play it, but because he didn't have anything else in his hand, because of those squirrels, it just, he pulled up his friends and they didn't help.
Yeah, those annoying little squirrels. But congratulations to both players.
Congratulations.
I mean, to even get this far, they've gotten plenty of prizing. I'm sure that Kurt would have loved to go on to the finals, but you know, he still gets a lot of stuff to walk
He
away
does.
with.
And congratulations to Brian. And we are going to go to a break now. And then Jonty and Liam are going to be bringing you our final match of Lorcana Challenge Chicago.